welcome back to Fantasy and Faith. I'm Noor Jahangir, and today, my complete and utter honor and bewilderment, I have Adrian Tchaikovsky joining me, author of 60 plus books, winner of the Arthur C. Clarke Award, podcaster, and author extraordinaire. Adrian, please introduce yourself to my audience.
Thank you. You're very kind. Yes, I'm a UK-based science fiction and fantasy writer. I am probably best known for the book Children of Time, which is kind of a high philosophy take on giant spiders from outer space. But I've written a very wide range of science fiction and fantasy books from a variety of corners in the genre.
Great. Again, Adrian's being humble is probably one of the best known science fiction authors in the world right now, not just in the UK. With the fans as far as Germany and Spain I've been hearing that you've been invited to conventions over there as well.
Yes, I was in Spain recently for their Celsius festival, which is enormous fun, and I certainly I get about in Europe quite a bit. I'm not much of a longer distance traveller, honestly, but Europe is just about within my reach.
Okay. So, I mean, you might recall our first interaction on Blue Sky. I admitted to having thought you were some independent author I came across in the 2010s. I was on Kindle Prime, and you get access to some free books. And I saw Dogs of War there, and I thought, interesting cover, but I haven't heard of this Adrian chap. Um, and then I think after a few months, it kept popping up, and I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna have a read. And I read it, and I was like, man, this guy is talented. How come I haven't heard of him yet? So I read it thinking he was an indie author. Then I went on and read Cage of Souls, I think, next, and then there's this series with the Architects.
Oh yes,
I
Final
I read
Architecture series. Yeah.
Final Architecture. Yeah, that was very different. It was quite scary science fiction novel compared to Children of Time. Um, so going back to the Dog of War series, I've read all three now, and most recently Beast Speaker, which was I think your most recent release.
Mhm.
Um, you explore the idea of distributed intelligence. I mean, let's put aside the fact that there are walking, talking dogs and bears and dragons in the series. What jumped out to me was the idea of the distributed intelligence, like bees and humus. Um, what drew you to that concept? I know you got a background in zoology and psychology, but distributed intelligence is such a brilliant idea. How do you think it challenges and enhances traditional notions of identity and agency?
Um, yeah, it makes a huge difference if you've got a character that doesn't have the singular focus. Um, a traditional character, or indeed how we think of ourselves. You think, right, this is what they or we are like. This is what they'll do in a particular situation, and this is the sort of the curve that a life will take, and we're very conditioned to that because it's the cornerstone of the human condition. With distributed intelligence, so what, like you say, the character bees is literally a swarm of bees. So the individual bees are living and dying all the time, but the character sort of exists in the space between all the bees that it currently has access to. And this is something I look at in a number of other books as well in various different ways. It's obviously a concept that fascinates some deep part of my mind. But then you have the character Humos, who is a human distributed intelligence, meaning that at the start at least, she is a set of clones who are in constant sort of mental contact, and they are simultaneously individuals and also part of a larger organism. And sometimes sometimes they cut off and then they rejoin, and there is this constant interflow of information. And that the way that works and the way that she relates to herself changes throughout the books of the series as time moves on, and she uses different methods to keep herself going. So simultaneously, and you see this especially in Beast Speaker, you have this character who has been going since the beginning of the series, which is by now covered several hundred years, and has memories of early characters in the series and earlier events. But at the same time, each instance of her is its own individual only sporadically in contact with the whole. And it's a really interesting writing challenge, honestly, because it does mean you're going a long way beyond the bounds of what we think of as a character in a book. And so you get this sort of it's sort of almost like the character is a diffuse cloud of points rather than a single sort of point in the book. And depending on how many of her are around and which ones they are, the character will be different whilst also essentially being the same person. I mean, one of the reasons I think this fascinates me is actually our understanding of how the human mind works is that actually we are not as consistent as we would like to think. That we do not necessarily make the decisions for the reason we think. Often, a lot of the time, we are giving ourselves post facto justifications for the things we've done that have arisen from lots of little neuron interactions within the mind. And fascinatingly, I mean, obviously, I do a lot of work in writing with insects and things like that, hence bees. But fascinatingly, this is how we think ants make decisions, because ants' nests are capable of making quite sophisticated decisions as a group, and they do this by each individual ant basically making a decision, and then when a certain proportion of the nest has come to a particular decision, the whole nest flips into that, and then all the ants will execute that particular course of action. And something similar may well happen with the way our neurons work, so that the brain will kind of shunt us into a particular direction, and then we will make excuses for why we have done that aren't necessarily the truth. So this this discontinuity between the way the human mind does actually seem to work and between the way that we traditionally feel it to work, which is to say that we are this sort of singular free-willed entity that makes decisions for rational reasons that we can appreciate, has always rather fascinated me. I mean, I think this is one of the things I did carry over from my psychology, sort of my degree level psychology that I studied.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think I read recently that there's still some individuality in ants and bees as well. Like you got lazy
Mm.
ants who are bunking off work like the rest of us, going for a little vaping break or something. So
I so we had a wasp nest near our house recently. I swear, so you get sort of flights of wasps going out and flights of wasps
yeah,
coming in. I swear I saw an individual wasp just sort of go out, wait for the rest of its colleagues to go, and then just tag on to the end of one coming in, so it didn't actually have to
yeah,
go off and do anything.
yeah.
And yes, and we
Oh,
don't know. It's there. There's some evidence of personality even in very simple creatures like that at an individual level, and weirdly enough, it seems to be more pronounced in that sort of social insect or social arachnid, for that matter, um, environment where we would really think of them as just components of a machine. And I think that's because interacting with others of your species, even if they are kind of semi-cloned sisters, as you get in a social insect environment, is going to bring out differences. And it's going to actually evolutionarily reward differences in personality, because it means that it gives the society as a whole a greater toolkit to deal with different situations.
yeah. So moving on to our next question, your portrayal of bioengineered beings like Rex raises ethical questions about free will, autonomy, and personhood. Was there a particular real-world inspiration or philosophical framework you drew from when developing this theme?
I mean, no one specific one. It's really a just a combination of a lot of different things, real events, real, usually quite unfortunate human attitudes, the history of
Mm,
cultures and how they personify and demonize and exploit other cultures and other kind of groups. There's a lot of in the way that the bioforms are viewed by humans. There's a lot of real human prejudice about how various groups of humans have viewed other groups. Um, it's just obviously to a certain extent it is easier to write about that sort of thing in a science fiction setting with something fantastical than it is to write about it in a straight up real sort of realistic setting where everywhere you turn you are going to be stepping on someone else's lived experience.
Mm. I find it interesting that you want to keep the psychology of the animals intact as well. Like the dogs are still wanting that human attention to be called a good dog and fearful of being called a bad dog, and that runs consistently through the Dog of War series. Um,
Yes, I
oh,
mean there's animal cognition is one of my big one of the things that fascinates me more than pretty much anything else. And one of the things that led to Dogs of War being written is I read a number of papers on dog cognition. And there is this fascinating idea that dogs have evolved to be fit for an environment which is human company,
mm,
and that dog brains work have kind of have evolved from a wolf brain to something far closer to human functionality than our most near evolutionary relatives, like chimps and the other apes, because that is what really determines whether historically dogs survive and have offspring or not, is how well they work with us.
yeah. I feel like cats have cause sussed even more than dogs have, though. They know
Well,
how to manipulate as well.
we haven't had cats for that long. That's the thing, and the cat relationship with us is much less dependent than dogs, and it's much less integrated than dogs. So cats
Mm,
are there's that standard line about did we domesticate cats or did cats domesticate us? And it's almost like uh, it's a working partnership early on where the cats they're around. It's almost like commensalism. There are various sort of scientific terms, but they are benefiting from being around people. They get shelter, they get food, but also people originally are where their food source of small rodents were attracted to, because of course we were keeping food at that
yeah,
point. So cats come around once you've got agriculture and grain stores and things like that. We have dogs much earlier because we have them as hunting animals and guard animals, and they predate that kind of
yeah,
settled lifestyle. So dogs have had a lot longer to adapt to us.
yeah. I suppose being cuter helps them as opposed to snakes or bats who also prey on small rodents that live around us.
Yes, I mean there are certainly parts of the world where having a rat snake living under the house is a perfectly normal thing. But yes, you wouldn't normally sort of have it curled up on your lap or anything like that. There's to a certain extent, if you to a certain extent, domesticating mammals is easier because you get that familial bond with mammals, which doesn't really exist with a lot of other animals in the same way, and which can kind of be hacked by domesticating processes. Um, but also, yes, I mean, if you look at a cat, a domestic cat and a wild cat, you tend to see, it's got bigger eyes, it's got bigger ears, it's got a much more kittenish look. There's a thing called neoteny, which is taking place, and that's because we are hardwired to react to certain stimuli, because they basically plug into the part of our mind that deals with human babies, or that's the theory. And so kittens and puppies and so forth, you get that cute reaction.
Yeah. Um, Staying with Dogs of War. So the animals within the series seem to walk a fine line between being technology and that again the animal psychology still being there. How do you pronounce? Is it ire or ire in
Um,
Beast?
Ire, I think, because
Ire.
it's Latin for anger.
Okay. So with ire, depending on how hot he gets or she gets, um, it changes the behavior. So snake mind kind of, or reptilian mind kind of takes over the kind more cold rational mind that he has when he's at cool body temperature. So, do you see this as a metaphor for how humanity manages and mismanages its own creations? Uh, the way that the animals, like Deacon, for instance, the way they were being controlled by factory bees, and how we're mismanaging at the moment AI. So, do you see the how
I mean, I don't. I think the mismanagement of AI is an entirely different order because I don't think there is an entity within AI that is being exploited in the same way. It's the AI that we have at the moment is basically a person-facing shell. There's no self
yeah,
within it. Whereas with the bioforms in the book, they very definitely have a self, and the health is, that self is rooted in the animal nature of them and the kind of the upgrading they've had that brings them closer towards humans, so that they can have that human facing element to them as well. And so you get that human animal conflict, which is a long beloved sort of genre fiction
mhm,
trope. Um, I think that should we develop an actual general AI, i.e., an actual sapient
mm,
artificial mind, then the way that the bioforms are treated in the books, especially in the first one, Dogs of War, would be genuinely relevant, because at that point you have something which is effectively alive and thinking and should really probably have some sort of rights, even if not sort of full human rights. And a large chunk of Dogs of War is the battle over what rights, if any, a bioform creature should have. I think the other relevant thing that is directly relevant to how we use technology at the moment is, the book is Dogs of War. They are used in the beginning of the book in a military
mhm,
situation, but one of the obvious things about the way they're being used is they have plausible deniability. If you wanted to do war crimes, as indeed the people in the book do, then it's very easy to have your terrifying robot dog do them for you. And then if it all gets found out and if you find yourself in hot water for having done war crimes, you can say, oh, bad dog. Obviously this creature went off the leash a bit. In the same way as we will absolutely see autonomous drones and other self-directed war machinery committing the most appalling things, I'm sure, in within our lifetimes in the near future. And should it ever matter enough that someone's knuckles are going to be wrapped, they will say, "Oh well, the programming, the algorithm, not what we meant to happen. Who could have predicted this thing?" This type of technology where you can ascribe self determination to it, whether genuine or fictional,
mm.
um, is pretty much purpose made to get the decision makers of military atrocities off the hook. So that's probably a bit heavy.
No, that's good. It's real good. So, with characters like Humos, for instance, I mean, I like the evolution because the way you seem to write is that every book in that series could stand alone without ever having read the previous books. You could read Beast Speaker, for instance, and it works completely fine. But for me, it's like that the evolution of the character. Because I thought Humos was brilliant in the first book, the way she was um, almost masterminding or managing the situation through her
Mhm.
clones. But the new iteration of her in Beast Speaker as the witch, and then the bunker wife and the monk. I think that seemed like almost an evolution of that idea.
Well, it's very much me trying to work through the logical parameters of, well, if I still want humors in the book, how can that even happen? Because in B Speaker, we've had a general collapse of human society. And if you've got something that is a technological sort of human hive mind, it's reliant on there being an infrastructure. And so Humos in the book is this exploration of, all right, well, how could you substitute for having a sort of a global communications net, which is not going to survive massive, a sort of a massive technological crash. And I mean, I won't go into the details because I'll let people just discover themselves if they read the book. But yes, Humos, being far-sighted enough to see the end coming, was able to manufacture a fix. And it's not necessarily terribly convenient, as she outlines when we first meet her, but she's found a way to preserve her sort of distributed self beyond the kind of the popping of the technological
Mhm.
bubble.
So is that I mean, there's various ideas of immortality in Beast Speaker. One is the humans, the rich humans who adapted themselves. There's Humos, who's managed to continue her life in one way or another, and then you've also got bees that, as I said, as
Mhm.
bees die and new ones are born, it carries on growing and it's persisting. So the original bees has gone to Mars, and then a version of bees returned to Earth. So immortality is bordering on religion a little bit. So I wanted to swoop sideways into religion and belief, if that's okay. So in the Shadow of Apt books, and these were your debut novels, weren't they? The Shadow of Apt, the Empire
Yeah.
of Black and Gold. Again, I read the first one. I found it really interesting. I didn't realize it was a debut novel when I read it because it was of that quality. Where I thought, oh, it's an Adrian Tchaikovsky book. It's going to be good. So I enjoyed it very much. There's different kinds of religious belief systems in that. Just as in Beast Speaker, bees on Mars become almost godlike. Bees on Earth, the original version, is like a devil. So, how much of your treatment of religion in your stories is down to your own personal beliefs?
So I am kind of agnostic, bordering atheist for my personal beliefs. So I kind of feel I'm standing outside um, any specific religious tradition. I mean, having said that, I've obviously been brought up in a Church of England environment because you can't really get away with it. You know, you get a lot of that sort of thing in school, and it just sort of follows you around. And I certainly use a lot of um, biblical references just because it's one of those. You know, I use the Bible and I use T.S. Eliot and I use a few other sort of touchstones like Shakespeare, just because you grow up within a certain educational system and you just become kind of suffused with those sort of things, and it becomes part of your standard reference toolkit. Um, I mean, Shadows of the Apt, religion tends to turn up a lot in fantasy, but it tends to turn up extremely shallowly. You normally, it is frequent. You'll get a religion, and it will perform a certain plot function, such as, for example, one very common trope is there's something in it's a bit like the Roman Catholic Church, and they are usually the bad guys, and kind of they have an inquisition and so forth. And then, if you look at the book carefully, so there's no indication really of why they believe anything
Mm.
or how any of this comes. It's just kind of like this big Roman Catholic Church shaped chunk that's wedged rather uncomfortably into a fantasy world. And similarly with other sort of religions, it's frequently a bit hazy as to why the religion is there, what it believes, how it works, or anything like that. And one of the things I decided with Shadows of that was actually they wouldn't have any sort of, I guess, numinous
Mhm.
beliefs. So you get a bunch of them, a bunch of the insect kingdom who do believe in magic, but that's because magic is absolutely real. And then you have a bunch of them that don't believe in magic because of they are the apt and they do other things. They can do machines, and the part of their brain that would do magic does the machine stuff instead. But no one is there's a suggestion I think that they may have had gods at some point, way back in the past, but no one really does that sort of thing. And then, I mean, there's a follow-on series called Echoes of the Fall, which deals with the people who are very religious, who live in the same world and actually use and how the different philosophies interact and what the underlying metaphysics are that lead one group of people to personify them as gods, and another group of people to see them purely as sort of as scientific forces almost in the way that the world works. And then I've looked at so the spiders have a religion in Children of
Yeah.
Time, and that gets sort of thoroughly investigated, and it's it's a religion that's based on a complete misunderstanding, but on the other hand, you see how it kind of shapes their society and how they kind of draw strength from it in adversity, even though you know as the reader that it's basically, they've decided that the satellite that orbits their world and is sending out a signal is some sort of divine being speaking to them. And then more recently in the Tyrant Philosophers fantasy series, there's a lot of religious stuff because the main adversary in that series, the Tyrant Philosophers of the title, they are essentially militant atheists who want to perfect the world, and the perfect world in their eyes has no gods, and there are a lot of gods in that world, and so they tend to try and capture them and render them down for sort of magical energy, as a part of their general program of erasing the culture and language and traditions of everyone that they conquer. And so there's a lot of religious stuff in that purely because it is that relevant to the plot. In fact, one of the characters in the first book, City of Last Chance, the first character you meet, is living in an attic apartment with God, or with his God, of whom he is the last worshipper and priest, because it's a religion that's fallen massively out of favor even before the Palatine came and outlawed gods in general. And so there is a lot of looking at religion and looking at why people turn to religion, and how religions develop over time in that series, probably more than in anything else I've written. But I think it's religion again is obviously something that fascinates me, despite the fact that it's not really a part of my life. I think it's mostly just because it is such a big part of the world, both currently and historically, that it's not something you can really easily ignore. And as someone who is kind of excluded from it by my own beliefs, I find it a fascinating thing to pick at and run permutations of when I'm creating worlds.
So, at what point do you start thinking about the religion of your races in your books? Is it like at the forefront, or is it something you do when you're looking at draft 3 or draft 4?
So the way I work is world build first, and then I make that world as solid and all encompassing as I can, and then that won't change. So if I'm doing religion in a particular book, it'll be built in there from the start, and it will run. The point is, bolting a religion on later is not
Mm,
going to. That's not how religions work. If you have a religion, it's going to suffuse the culture, even if it is no longer a practiced religion. The fact of it having existed in the past. So in the in an upcoming book, there's a religion based on a god who has been dead for a very long time. But the fact that that god did exist is still an enormous part of the culture, and the phrases and the ways that people live and the traditions and the superstitions all still exist, even though the religion has been and gone. And that's kind of how it should work. I mean, like I said, a lot of fantasy fiction does not honestly do religion terribly well because it doesn't really treat it like a
mm.
religion. It treats it often just like as a social faction, or either it's a social faction and there isn't really a non-material element to it, or it is something that literally physically exists, in that yes, there is a god will smite you if you do this, this, and this. You are in that Dungeon and Dragon sense, you are a cleric, god will give you special powers, that kind of thing. And at that point, at either of those ends, faith doesn't really come into
Mm.
it. So it's there is this rather interesting middle ground, which of course is how religions work in the real world, where faith is a paramount thing because you do not generally get actual irrefutable evidence of any any belief system, or let's face it, we'd all be doing it. And that sort of that uncertainty is quite a hard thing to bring into fantasy fiction.
Yeah. I mean, my own take, coming from the Muslim faith of Islam, um, as you said, it suffuses everything. And even when I'm writing, I have to take into consideration what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, what kind of themes can I tackle. So there's there's no sex scenes in any of my stories, not even really overtly romantic relationships. So there will be romance, but it'll be more kind of um, classical novel with long looks and sighing and all that stuff. But it's never a major theme. And even if I have violence in my books, I have to show it as being repulsive to some degree, especially when it's done for the sake of violence on its own. So I can't be excessive in how I show that. So if it's done for righteous reason, I have to show that it's righteous. If it's done for nefarious reasons, I have to show that is nefarious. So I feel, I think, not so much restricted, but uh, that I need to stay within certain guidelines. And assuredly, a lot of Muslim writers don't follow those guidelines. There's some major writers out there who've written books that technically haven't followed those guidelines, whether they're introducing romance into the stories or even having sexual relationships in the stories. So I mean, that's part of the reason why I started podcast was because people started claiming it as Muslim fantasy or Islamic fantasy, and I felt like that needed to be qualified by a person who lives the tradition, understands it, and understands basically how to write as well. So that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast, and I started blogging about it quite a lot. And it's
Hmm.
interesting because my earliest influence for writing was C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I didn't see the Christian allegory, even though we had scriptures in my primary school. I grew up in the 1980s, so it wasn't RE then; it was just
Mhm.
scriptures. But even then, I didn't see the kind of Christian allegory. And same with The Hobbit. When I read that, I mean, Tolkien is less overt about how he portrays belief and religion and everything else. But that was C.S. Lewis's was the trigger for me that I think it kickstarted my brain. It wanted me to um, start writing stories to explore fantasy because I'd never experienced fantasy that way. I'd seen Star Wars and Superman, which used to come on every Christmas, but I hadn't thought of fantasy as a genre as a separate thing until I came across the Land of Wardrobe. So remember.
Yeah, the Christian message in the Narnia books completely passed me by as well at the time.
I don't think it's there for kids to pick up on. I think it's more for the adults or more for C.S. Lewis that I need to say this and then someone's going to say it. So I've read somewhere that Dragonlance, the Margaret Weiss, the Tracy Hickman books were your spark. I mean, I've read the whole Dragonlance series, The Time of the Twins. I've read some of the sequel ones that are set much later on. So what was it about Dragonlance that really got you going? Was that the thing that got you writing?
It was. I mean, honestly, it was. So up to that point, I'd been a very, very keen, and continue to be a very, very keen tabletop role player, especially a games master. But the idea of writing books for a wider audience literally didn't occur to me as a thing that could possibly happen. And then running into the Dragonlance books, they are someone writing up their Dungeons and Dragons campaign in novel form. And that was just this light bulb moment of this is actually a thing I could potentially do. And it took me a long old time to actually get to the point where my style was worth anyone reading. But the hobby, the role playing hobby, is actually enormously useful to writers because you're the world when you're creating a world as a games master, when you're creating characters, all of those skills are directly transferable. But most of all, you're doing it for other people. You have in your mind the idea, well, how is my audience, even if it's an audience of like three other people at a table, how is that audience going to receive this? How is this going to work? And so you're thinking of that right from the start, which is very, very useful when you then move on to right. I need to write a book, and I want this book to make people think this at this point, and feel that at that point, and that kind of thing. You've already got that machinery in your head. That means you're automatically thinking in that way.
I think there's other similarities as well. We both got a shared history of submitting stories to the Zenos magazine. I got rejected a lot by Zenos, but they always gave me feedback. There would be like a little kind of a complimentary slip with a handwritten feedback on it. I think they knew that I was very young, um, probably a bit deluded about my skill level at that point. But your experience was slightly different. That I think you wrote in and you were accepted, but then the magazine collapsed.
So I got half a dozen stories published over several years, and they ran this yearly competition. I kept submitting for the competition and not getting anywhere. And then that one year, um, must have been early to mid 90s. I submitted a story called "The Roar of the Crowd," um, and I think it was the winner or the joint winner of the competition, and there was going to be some money. It was like 50 whole pounds, and I was wildly excited that suddenly I was a professional writer. And then the magazine folded, and the story was never published in that format, and not for many years. Um, but I mean, I'm enormously grateful to Zenos, even though there's quite a gap between that and my actual first book coming out. Having that magazine to write for really gave me a target. It gave me the sense that, genuinely there was an actual audience who might read what I was writing. The Roar of the Crowd has since been published. It remains, I think, I still feel that that is the first piece of writing I produced that was genuinely of professional standard. So yeah, I mean, it was it was crushingly disappointing at the time, but I am inordinately grateful that that magazine existed when it
Yeah,
did.
I think the same thing as well because there wasn't all that much at the time in the UK. I think there was Interzone magazine, but over in America they had Clark's World and Locus magazine operating. But I felt for new writers it was quite difficult, uh, quite challenging to even submit stuff to Interzone, even though I had stacks of the magazine to kind of research the writing styles on. What kept you going after the Zenos debacle?
Oh, well, I mean, debacle is a bit strong, but yeah, I mean, I was, as far as novels go, it was about 15 years of submitting, about, writing a book a year, submitting it, getting either nothing back or sort of little slips, form worded rejection slips. I mean, honestly, I barely kept going. I mean, writing was all I wanted to do. Everything else was just kind of paying the bills. And it wasn't getting anywhere. I mean, there was no real sense even of some sort of incremental improvement. It was just bouncing off for years and years and years, and genuinely was having a bit of an effect on my mental health. Um, I got to the point where I said, right, if I haven't got anywhere by my 35th birthday, I'm just going to give up on the writing entirely. And I don't know if I'd been able to do that or not, because it is quite a compulsion with me. But as it happened, I got the first interest from an agent a couple of weeks before I turned 35. And that is the agent who took me on, who was able to sell Empire and Black and Gold. And, the agent I'm still with. So, I mean, all I can say is it was very tough. It was, yeah, I mean, it was getting to the point where the utter lack of any kind of visible progress was wearing me down quite a lot, and I'm very glad it did actually turn the corner when it did.
I think after having submitted stories to magazines for a while, I knew my first novel wasn't ready. So I crafted it. I started writing when I was 14 and then crafted it again throughout university. Part of my course was creative writing. So I worked on some of it then. And then following that, I think I spent another 6, 7 years polishing it before I was brave enough to start sending out. And then for I think 2, 3 years, I got rejection after rejection after rejection. Then I think just then people like Lulu were coming out, Lulu Publishing,
Hmm.
Smashwords. So I had a lot of writer friends that suggested that the book was good enough. You should try going down the self-publishing route. And in the 90s, I remember self-publishing was a dirty word. There was a lot of people out there exploiting um, writers. Um, but so it took me a while to get onto the independent publishing. But after my second book, I felt like maybe it was time to take a break. Um, when again I got a whole pile of rejections from every agent, every small press and large press traditional publisher. I thought maybe it's me and not the books. So I stepped away, went off, did a PGC, did my doctorate, and now I'm coming back with another two, three planned books. So hopefully it happens this time around. Um,
Oh, best of luck.
Thank you. And I think you also had the struggles of using a word processor where you can't trust it to say more than one chapter at a time.
Yeah, I had an old Amstrad, and if you went beyond a certain sort of size of file, it would not save it, and it would crash it when you tried. And so, yeah, no, it was a nightmare. I mean, I still tend to write books in a succession of small, discrete files, just because that was such a sort of grotesque experience of losing so much work each time.
Don't you use things like Dropbox now to back up stuff?
Oh no, no, but I
Yeah,
do, and I probably, I don't have to work that way anymore. But it's
I
just
bet.
so much a part of how I think. And yes, I mean, I save, I've got all sorts of different places I save copies just in case and that kind of thing. It's very belt and
Yeah.
braces, just because I'm so aware of how much I'd have to redo if I lost an entire book. And occasionally, you do hear that someone turns up and say, "Yeah, my word processor has just eaten my book, and I can't find it anywhere, and I don't know what's happened to it." And computers do things.
I had a Panasonic that my dad bought for me for £100, which was a massive investment for him because he hadn't seen any money coming out of writing yet. But I think it was just the wrong equipment. Um, I don't think my writing really got anywhere until I got myself a laptop, and then my productivity went up quite a lot. Talking about productivity, you're probably one of the most prolific writers I know of, other than Terry Pratchett and Stephen King. According to fictiondb.com, you have 66 books and novellas in print. Is that right?
um, I couldn't swear to it. That's about right, possibly including some that are still
Yeah.
upcoming. But it's got to be in that general sort of ballpark.
That's
Yeah.
not including translations.
No. But then obviously that is essentially the same book. And also, I mean, the work there is entirely the translators and not mine in bringing into that new edition. So I would be mendacious to claim it as my own.
So what does a typical writing day look like for you? How are you so productive? Do you have it? Is it more structured, or do you work intuitively? What's going on?
So I mean, I don't think I write more per day than another full time author. Say, I'll usually write in the morning. I'll sort of have emptied the well by about lunchtime, and then afternoon will be edits and admin and various other writing adjacent stuff. And then hopefully by the next morning, it's all, the well has filled again, and I'll be able to get another chunk of writing out. Um, Whilst I've got no hard and fast answer for the productivity, I think part of it is that when I'm not writing, I'm always thinking about what happens next in the book. So that when I sit down, I'm immediately ready to go. There's no sort of staring at the page or anything like that. The first few paragraphs are kind of queued up in my head, and then at that point, once you start going, it's a bit like siphoning a liquid. It keeps going and going and going because you've got a momentum then. The other thing though is I think a lot of it is the world building, oddly enough. I mean, I do plan. So usually I will have a book plotted out in advance. Um, but I think more than that, the fact that the world feels very complete and real to me when I'm writing in it, which is something I kind of need to be the case because I need to know where everything is coming from. I need that in that consistent environment. But it does mean that first draft I produce, everything fits together. Everything has come from that same place. I don't need to go back and do vast amounts of edits and sort of retcons and things like that. So when I've produced a first draft, I will read through, and usually I will shorten as much as I can because I do still tend to overwrite. And I will correct a few. There may well be a couple of things that I thought of while I'm writing that mean I have to insert things into, or change things in the earlier chapters to make that consistent. But overall, my first draft and my submission draft tend to be very similar. So where I save time, I think, is I don't generally have a complete second draft or third draft or anything like that, because everything fits neatly when I get it onto the page the first time.
So,
And if I'm gaining time anywhere in the process, it's got to be that.
so do you do all your planning in notebooks, or are you using some? Do you have a wall covered in post-it notes with little bits of string tied?
I mean, honestly, way back in the day when I was young, most of it was still in my head, which I cannot do anymore because I am not young. But what I tend to default to is long and rambling word files with various sort of headers. So I'll have factions and I'll have traditions, and I'll have just like little working out little details like how people dress and what people drink, and what is the food like in this city, and that kind of thing is just a really useful thing to have at your fingertips, because it means you don't suddenly stop in the middle of a paragraph and think, oh well, what are they eating, or what do people do in this city in the evening, and that kind of thing. And again, this is a very role-playing gamey sort of thing, and it's a very useful habit to have acquired very early on and carried into the writing. But yeah, it is just a Word document that just goes on and on and on with all of the ideas, and I try and get them into some sort of semblance of order so I can find them later on, and I'll make a list of what things are called, and what sort of special names and language I'm going to invent for this particular book and that kind of thing. And with some books, I'll go on and then just write a chapter by chapter plan of exactly what will happen in the book. And with other books, I'll just take the world and follow characters around and see what they do.
Okay. So have you considered using wikis? And I think Brendan Sanderson talks a lot about having a wiki. I think he uses um, a kind of a very basic Wikipedia style software that he has somebody fill in now. I use Obsidian. All it is just documents that connect each other through keywords and creates a relational database.
I I strongly suspect it's one of those things that, were I to learn to use it and think in the way that you would need to use
Yeah,
it, it would probably be more efficient than what I'm currently doing. But the amount of time it would take me
learn it.
to change the way I think means it's never going to happen. So I am in no way standing up for my system. It's just the system I have.
So, hasn't your system evolved since you started?
Well, as I've got older, it means I'm writing more and more things down, because my head is less and less able to contain them. But that's really, it's not. Though I think my system has devolved, if anything, over the years.
Yeah. I mean, I get it because I let my own stories brew in my head for quite a long time before I start writing down
Mhm.
ideas. And it's not until the full
Well,
story's there.
the other thing I do is for new stuff, I have like a note file on my phone, and I will, whenever an idea, however incomplete, will occur, I'll always jot that down, because I know that there is a maxim, and this might be Stephen King. It's just like you don't have to write ideas down, because only the good ones are the ones you won't forget. I do not believe that. I do not believe my mind is that good at remembering things. I don't know. How do you know that you haven't forgotten loads of good ideas? Because you've forgotten them. I really, I will always jot the ideas down, and then quite frequently, multiple ideas will sort of come together in a single book. So you'll have an idea. I really like this idea, but there's not enough there
Mm.
to run a narrative off. But here's this other idea, and actually, they kind of fit together and thematically complement one another. And if you can get that sort of, you get them locked together neatly enough, then that's an entire book between those two ideas.
Yeah. And are you a one book at a time person, or can you work on multiple projects?
No, always. Well, I mean, you're always, there's a bit of a conveyor belt of, well, this is the book you're writing, and this is the book you're editing, and this is the book
Yeah.
you're doing the
Yeah.
final proofs on, and that kind of thing. But I'm only ever working on one book as in the actual writing sphere. So yes, I couldn't possibly have multiple books at that level of detail in my head at once. It would get very confusing.
And that's what I was incapable of writing at the same time as doing the doctorate. My brain just couldn't focus on those two things at the same time. So I'm like you.
Yeah, I mean, and I think yeah, and I think there are. I mean, one of the interesting things I did find, I've done some writing for like computer games and tabletop games where I'm producing just sort of materials, like create us 10 aliens or 5 monsters and things like that. I can do that as well as writing because that doesn't engage the narrative part of the brain because the things I'm creating are shorn of story. They're just literally just fleshed out ideas, really. But yes, there is a particular part of the brain that generates story, and I can't double up on that part of the brain. I can only do the one thing.
Okay, what which games?
And I imagine that the
So
sorry.
which video games have you worked on?
So the big one is Exodus, which is coming out. I am not entirely sure when. It's like a big sort of science fiction role playing game. So I worked on that, and Peter Hamilton worked on that, and they've got a lot of really interesting sci-fi stuff there, and it's a broad enough universe. It was a lot of fun just to create bits and pieces bouncing off the stuff they've they already had there, and I've created some D&D stuff for a couple of sort of campaigns, and possibly some stuff in the future. But it's I don't think, for example, I would want to create story for a game because I think then that would be using the same part of my mind. But just creating bits and bobs for them was a lot of fun.
Right. I mean, it would be good if somebody just came along and said, "Well, we like your Bearhead novels, or sorry, Dogs of War novels, and we'd like to turn them into a Deus Ex style game where your dogs and bears can augment themselves to do different things." I mean, that would be pretty cool, I think, as a video
That
game.
would be absolutely
Yeah,
grand. I suspect I wouldn't necessarily want to be involved at any deep level though, because I'm not a game
as
designer.
long as they keep paying you royalties. I think,
Well, yeah, I mean that's, but also it would be lovely to see my work translated into
yeah,
other media.
yeah,
I think that's something that most writers are always very keen to see, so long as the adaptation is good.
yeah,
I think that it must be rather depressing if you get the adaptation, it actually happened, and then it's not actually what you wanted
yeah.
after all.
I think the most successful conversion was The Witcher because those translated into really good games. But then I don't know if you ever played the Crondor games on PC. Raven Fist's stories were changed.
No, I've not read. I've not read a lot of
Okay.
First. I read. I think I've read Magician and a couple of others. But no, I did. I'm not sure I even realized there was a game of
Yeah,
those.
it's old. I think we're talking late 90s, but it
Oh,
was
okay.
eventually the novel turned into a game, so there wasn't that much going on in terms of
Yeah, I
regular
mean,
novel.
this is. I mean, I guess if you're thinking like a TV or a film thing, the possibility of a faithful adaptation exists. It's still not necessarily the
No.
best thing you could want for it. But with a game, you need player agency, and at that point, you can't do the book. You can do the setting and tell a different story in that setting, and that's, I think, what I would want. But I think the trying to retread. I mean, I know you get like visual novels and things like that, so there are some modes of game which are more railroaded as far as what happened. But even so, I kind of feel the whole point of the game is that it is interactive and that the agency of the player needs to have an impact.
Okay. Um, Again, I've read and heard on over other podcasts, like you were on recently on the British Fantasy Society podcast. I think you talked about film projects. I think one of your new series is being made into a film.
They've recently announced so Saturation Point, which
Saturation
is
Point. Yeah.
a novella, has been picked up. I mean, there's so it's got a studio and some interesting names attached to it. You never know. I mean, most of the time, these things don't
No.
go anywhere. And I think as a writer, you sort of condition yourself not to get terribly excited because obviously, if you did and then it didn't happen, it's kind of crushingly disappointing because you're very invested in it at that point. But yes, they. I mean, it is enormously flattering that someone would want to even get to that stage. I mean, I think that Saturation Point is very filmable. Um, some of my other stuff, like Children of Time or Shroud, is much more difficult, I think, because so much is happening in a non-human psychological arena. But Saturation Point is actually written as sort of found footage, so it's inherently suited to be being made into a film. So who knows?
Um, which novel have you read, like a fantasy or science fiction novel, that you think would make a really good film?
Oh, I mean, I'd like to. I mean, they were actually at one point they were actually going to be filming Gareth Powell's Embers of War, which would be an amazing space opera film if you had the budget for it. Um, and I would love for someone else to pick that up and carry the torch for it because I love that book. I think that you could also do a lot with Emma Newman's science fiction, so Planetfall or especially After Atlas, which I mean they're sort of the sort of books where in the time since they were published they've become distressingly more relevant than they were than they were at the time. Um, but yeah, I mean, honestly, we're in a bit of a golden age of amazing science fiction at the moment. There are so many good writers. I mean, obviously, we've recently had things like I'm really delighted that the Murderbot TV series has done so
Mm.
well. For example, because Martha Wells is an amazing writer, and also just because it shows that it's not someone doing Tolkien again. It's not someone doing Lewis again. It's not someone doing some other property which has had two or three outings and has already kind of had the joy squeezed out of it. It's something new and current, and they've done a really good job with it.
Are you a fan of the Andy Weir's The Martian? And I think Project Hail Mary's been made into a film as well now, hasn't it?
Project Hail Mary is being filmed. Yeah, I mean, I didn't see the film of The Martian. I did read and enjoy the book. That was a lot of fun. Project Hail Mary has been near the top of my read list, but my reading speed is glacial at the moment. I basically need to get hold of the audiobook, and then that will get it in front of me much more quickly. But I hear very good things about it.
I read the book, and when I read it, I was thinking, well, if they ever tried to make this into a film, it'd be a lot harder to do than The Martian was. But then The Martian, the book reads very differently to the film. I think people just assume that there's a lot. They do. I mean, you can see a lot of the book in the film, but there are like differences in how it's delivered. I think even the way it starts, he just wakes up on Mars alone, and I think Hail Mary starts something similar. The main character wakes up alone on a spaceship, not remembering where he is or why he's there. So I think some fiction is harder to translate into other mediums, but certainly,
Well, I mean, one of the things that novel writing does better than any other form is that interiority of thought. But for that reason, that is the part of novel writing that is inordinately difficult to bring over to the screen without sort of long and tedious voiceovers and things like that. There are going to be books that are inherently harder to bring to the screen than others. But on the other hand, Villeneuve's The Arrival, uh, based on Ted Chiang's, I think, The Story of Your Life. I may have got that title slightly wrong. Is kind of one of those. Yeah, they fight. They actually filmed the thing. One of those things that people probably said you could never film, and they did a really good job. So yeah, who
who
knows?
knows? So to try to bring this episode to a bit more of a head, if you were a young writer, you were asked to balance creativity with consistency in your output, what would you advise? How would a young person manage to develop that level of consistency that they need, but still remain creative?
Well, this is really tough because every writer I know has a different process. So what I can't really do is say, well, this is how you write. Everyone has got to find that particular method that works for them. The only thing I'd say is basically a lot of it is going to come down to time management, and everyone has different resources in that respect. Um, I'm lucky in that I was always able to just use whatever time the day gave me. and write at least a bit every day, which I think is a very useful practice if you can do it. So, when I had a full-time job, I would be writing late evenings just before going to bed. When I went full-time, I was writing early mornings because I'd got my son off to school, and then that I had that time there. I can write on trains, I can write in hotels, I can write in airports. All of this stuff. I'm very flexible, and that is actually, I don't know if that's something that you can make happen for yourself, but it's a very useful thing if you can do it. But just carving out a little bit of time in your routine to say, right, this is my writing time, and then you kind of have to defend it, because to anyone else around you, writing time looks like you're not doing anything, or at least not anything important. So you kind of have to make people around you understand, no, this right, I am now writing. Unless something is actually on fire, you need to give me an hour. And then at the end of the hour, I'll say, right. And like I say, keeping your mind turning over what's going on in the book is useful, because then when you have that very limited time, you can make the best use of it. I know Cory Doctorow's writing method is ending each writing session in the middle of a sentence, so you know exactly
Yeah,
where
I've
you're
read
picking
about
up.
that.
But something like that, so that when you sit down again, you can go. Because time is precious. We all have vast numbers of different demands on our time. You need to try and just hammer a fence around that little bit of time that you're going to use for writing, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anything else you want to add?
Oh, actually, one other thing. For the new writer who's just like this is it's like this is the one secret they don't want you to know. There is a trope about the tormented artist who can only write when the thing that's going terribly for them, when they're horribly miserable and so forth. Those are not generally good circumstances in which to write. Being horribly miserable, you don't have to be miserable to create art. That is a frankly kind of damaging, dangerous idea. Try and enjoy it. I really enjoy writing. One of the reasons I write as much as I do is I actively love that act of creation. It is enormously satisfying to me in the way that pretty much nothing else is. If you can get yourself into that mindset that you are allowed to enjoy writing for your own pleasure, for publication, to show your friends, for a role-playing game, writing for archive or own fanfic, anything like that, if you can enjoy writing, that is going to get you further than just about anything else.
What would you recommend to start? I mean, when we started, it was all short stories. The way you would build your name up
Mm.
is by submitting as much as you can to short story magazines. W- w- What do you think that market is now for new writers coming in
I mean, I don't know, because I haven't been a new writer coming into the
for a
industry
long time?
for decades, and the industry has changed enormously. I think in the last 30 years, it's probably changed more than it did in the previous
Yeah,
100. With mostly in a way that means there are more ways of getting in, but they all have their own kind of hazards and challenges and requirements. So, if you wish to be a successful indie author, which is absolutely a thing that you can be, you need to be able to run your own publicity machine with an enormous amount of energy and enthusiasm to get your book in front of people. And if you can do that, it can work extremely well. And you can do extremely well financially out of it. But it is a whole extra job as well as writing the books. And having heard people talk about it, it seems to take more effort than just the writing of the books, is keeping that all of those publicity plates spinning. Sorry. Um, so And as far as long form or short form work, or novels, novellas, which are now a thing, which certainly
yeah,
didn't exist as a commercially viable opportunity when I was first writing, um, I find different writers have things that they gravitate to, and try them all out if 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 you're not quite sure where that is for you. So there are still, you can't make a living out of it particularly, but there are still outlets for short fiction. I certainly wrote a lot of short stories for 20 quid a pop for small press anthologies in the UK. There are still some magazines. Some places like Tor.com or React, or as I think they call themselves, actually do still pay reasonably well for short fiction. Beyond that, I mean, my passion was always novels, so I basically just wrote novels for 15 years until that stuck. But like a lot of other things, it's a matter of finding what the form is that works for you, and then just working out how you can best leverage that into getting it before an audience.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. Um, so before we finish, if you could tell the audience what you've got going on, what you got coming out soon. I know Beast Speaker's been out now for a couple of months. Ah,
Yes, and I think this month we have a new novella out called The Hungry Gods, which is a story about venture capitalists coming back from space to ruin the Earth again, and precisely what happens to them. Um, Beyond that, we have new fantasy novella Lives of Bitter Rain, which is in the Tyrant Philosopher series. And next year, the big release is Children of Strife, which is the fourth book in that series.
excellent. What about the stage? Or because I know you act as well, don't you?
Oh, well, no, I mean, not for decades.
Maybe.
I used to do a lot of amateur dramatics back at sort of university and immediately after. And it was one of those things. It's like, it was a very big thing in my life at the time I did it. And then I occasionally think, oh, it would be nice to get back into that. But good Lord, I don't have the time anymore.
Maybe you and James Barkley could do a production at BFS, Fantasygon. What do you reckon? Next year, let's make a deal.
So waiting for Godot, yes.
I'll ask James if he wants to partner up with you, do a short production. Thank you very much, Adrian. It's been great having you on. And for all the listeners out there,
You're very welcome.
thank you very much. And to all the listeners, stay tuned. We will have some more interviews and podcasts coming up.